There are many scarce resources that a founder has: time, funding, talent, good customers. And I would argue that there is something that's often missed out, and that is really emotional energy. I would argue that the ability to regulate your emotions, to keep your calm as you're running your startup is one of the most scarce resources you can have. And it's the most precious resources, I would argue. So my name is Feng Yuan. Besides the fact that I'm having my third kid in a couple of days, in my day job, I am Vice President of Aicadium. It is Temasek's AI Center of Excellence. But before I sold my company to Temasek, I was CEO and co-founder of Basis AI. Basis AI was an early-stage Sequoia-backed responsible AI startup. And so I've been through the journey of this emotional roller coaster, and I'd like to share with you a couple of my observations and my learnings about the importance of emotional energy. Now, when you go into a startup, the amount of emotional intensity is just 10, 100 times more than a regular corporate job, right? You're facing all sorts of emotions. You're facing a fear of failure, a fear of disappointing your stakeholders, your investors, your early employees who took a bet, right? Who took a bet to join you as a founder. You're always kind of anxious, about difficult conversations you're going to have with customers or one-on-ones with employees. Every now and then, you've got positive emotions of euphoria, of pride when you've closed an important deal or you closed funding. The emotions that you face run through an entire gamut, right? You've got highs, you've got lows, but the emotional intensity and the emotional energy that's required is completely different in a startup. One of the things I realized was that in order to successfully navigate a startup, you really need to think about emotional regulation and keeping an equilibrium. What does this mean? It means you've got a packed schedule. You're context switching. You're talking to data science, talking to engineering, talking to marketing, talking to customers. And in the next call, you're trying to make an important decision that's going to make or break your startup. How do you keep your calm? How do you cut through all the noise and all the things that are running through your head to make that right decision? Secondly, you're facing tons of pressure from investors, from customers. How do you insulate your team from that emotional anxiety? Because if what you're doing is just amplifying and transmitting all that anxiety that you're facing, all that pressure to your team, then you're not giving them that space to do their best job. Or you're going at 100 miles an hour and then you're having to do a one-on-one with an employee who's suffering or who's underperforming. How do you slow yourself down to have that reflective coaching session with that employee? All that takes a huge amount of emotional regulation and emotional calm. And research has shown that human beings only have a certain amount of emotional capacity to do these difficult tasks. As you go through the day, as you do a lot of these emotionally difficult tasks, you run out of fuel, your tank runs empty, and then you're no longer able to control your emotions, to regulate them. And what happens? Then you get dysfunction. Then you get people making rash decisions out of fear, out of anxiety, not out of rationality. Then you get infighting, you get emotions boiling over, you get the cycle of dysfunction that you see in certain startups. So I would argue that because an early stage startup is so much dependent on the energy, on the drive, on the verve of the founder, it's what holds things together. And because emotional energy is a finite resource, it's essential to think about emotional energy as a strategic resource, to think about it intentionally. Because if you don't manage your emotional energy as a founder, there is strategic risk, there's existential risk, and therefore you need to think about this and manage your emotional energy absolutely essentially. And today I just want to share with you 5 things I've learned about what sucks emotional energy and things that I've learned about managing emotional energy as you go through a founder or a startup journey. So the first thing is this: don't let underlying tensions simmer. You've seen this in corporates before. There are underlying dynamics and tensions. These are destructive to a startup. I had an experience where an early core member of the team had lost the faith of his team members. The team members didn't feel like he was pulling his weight. He wasn't doing a terrible job, but he wasn't doing a great job. But the dynamic had become where everyone was drained every time they talked to this person or had a conversation with this person. I gave myself 2 weeks. I had a conversation with everybody in the team involved, including this individual, and we made a decision to move him outside the company. It was amicable, but we had to make a decisive decision. In a big corporate, you take more time, you take 6 months, you give everyone a chance. In a startup, the moment a dynamic is sucking emotional energy from the team, you've got to deal with it and really, really make decisive action. So that's the first thing about making sure you don't have underlying tensions draining your emotional energy. The second thing I learned was you really can't look too far in the future or look too far in the past, right? In a startup, you're making so many important decisions. Any decision could kill the startup. You're making decisions with so little information, and you're going to make a mistake. And there's no time or emotional energy to regret, to ruminate, to think back, oh no, I should have made this decision. Or oh no, what would happen in 6 months or 1 year's time, because those are things you can't control. So you really have to focus on the present. And that's easier said than done, right? That's really difficult to do. And the trick I gave myself was to imagine my startup as a board game or a chess game. So I used to play board games. And the great thing about it is, in a board game, you only have a finite number of moves. That's your runway. You've got information in front of you. That's all on the board. You've got certain information that you don't have. That's concealed information. But you have to make a move. You have to make a move, and you can't take it back. And there's no point thinking back about the move that you could have made 2 or 3 moves ago. You just keep going, and you're just being in the present. Right? So that's the second thing I've learned, really, really focus on being in the present. The third thing I learned is to be careful of false emotional energy. A lot of startup founders I know talk a lot about being in the zone, being busy. They like the fact that they always have a packed schedule and they're always making progress because they're busy. But being busy is very dangerous because it can create blind spots. So one founder I spoke to had delegated the day-to-day business development to his colleague, and suddenly he had headspace to think about the next 6 months of his startup journey. And that's when he became really scared, because he had been chalking up deals, deal after deal after deal, but when he took a step back, he realized that there were inherent issues with scaling his startup in the medium term, 6 months later. And the busyness almost blindsided him to this longer term view. Because his headspace was so caught up with the immediate here and now, he had almost been in denial about the future of the startup. And this busyness, this false energy that he got had actually allowed him to be in denial. So beware of false emotional energy, because that can distract you, right, from the true cause of your startup. The fourth thing I'll mention is that a startup is always about that balance between optimism, emotional energy, to keep you going, and delusion, right? Now, every startup founder needs to be inherently optimistic. If you're pessimistic, don't do a startup. Pick gardening or something, right? But as you're optimistic, it is surprisingly easy to slip into delusion, thinking that there's always light at the end of the tunnel and not facing up to facts. And this is where it's really important to have a small group of external counsel. People who are not involved in the day-to-day of your startup, but who can provide you a perspective, wisdom from experience. This could be a friend who is also a startup founder in a different industry. It could be a seasoned retired executive who knows your industry really well, or a friend who just really understands the way you think. I had the fortune of having advice from a board advisor. We were 1 year into the startup when COVID hit. And the biggest temptation was to preserve runway by cutting the team, by laying off members of the team. And when I asked him for advice, his advice was very sure and very certain. He said to me, Feng, I've never run an AI startup, but in my 30 years of management in big corporates, every time we've had a downturn, I've always kept my strong team together, because the boost I got in the motivation, in the commitment from the team, far outweighed any cost saving I got from a 20 or 30% reduction in headcount. And that was all he said to me. And he said, yours is a different setting, but his advice gave me the assurance I needed. The emotional burden of making that decision was so much lighter because I had this external counsel. And the last point I'll make is, whenever you're thinking about replenishing your emotional energy, think about why you did your startup. Think about your purpose and go back to that. Maybe you did your startup because you wanted to change the lives of your customers. So spend 2 weeks talking to your customers, understanding how they're using your product. Maybe you did it because you wanted to build a great product in engineering. Go back to writing code if you haven't been doing that. But use that to remind yourself of why you did that startup to replenish that energy. So ladies and gentlemen, a startup is a really difficult emotional endeavor, and I will argue that emotional energy is the most scarce and precious resource. Raising your emotional energy, if you're doing a startup, your investor or your friend is doing a startup, is just as important as raising your next round. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the FinTech Festival.